All right, morning everybody. Let's get started. So it's great to see you. Thanks for coming. You've obviously survived the first few days of the conference, which is probably an achievement in its own right. So I wanted today to talk a little bit about the process of developing apps. And I guess I'm thinking about different types of apps here. I'm thinking of apps for SharePoint, or as we now know them, SharePoint add-ins. Hopefully you got that memo about this name change, which is just yet another curveball to confuse us slightly. So in terms of SharePoint add-ins, but also the new flavor of Office 365 apps. And I guess I'm curious. So first of all, tell me if you're a developer. Put your hands up if you're a developer. All right. So what I expected, the vast majority of the room. So tell me if you've done any form of app development for SharePoint. All right. So most, definitely. And tell me finally if you've done any kind of app development using the new Office 365 app approach. All right, so we've got some, which is basically what I expected. Now, I'm going to focus kind of on the Office 365 app approach because it's new and I think there's some things to be aware of there. Actually, 75% of it at least applies to SharePoint apps and SharePoint add-ins as well. And towards the end, my final demo is really focusing on SharePoint add-ins because I'm conscious that there's lots of app development that happens that really isn't about the new flavor of Office 365 apps. So I definitely want to come back at the end and focus on that for a little bit, and we'll look at any small differences between the other things that we've discussed. All right. So, I'm kind of going for the emotional connection with you guys. I want to get you all on board and, try and show you a little bit about who I am. So, these aren't my kids, by the way. It's amazing what you can rent off the internet. No, I'm just kidding. So, I'm an independent consultant. I actually work with a company in the UK who have actually worked with these guys for a long time, have a long-standing relationship with them. I act as their head of development, a company called Content and Code. I've got a team of around 20 devs, and we're generally busy with lots of different types of SharePoint development. I'd say it's about 50-50, whether it's on-premises SharePoint versus Office 365, probably starting to shift a bit more towards Office 365. But we see a lot. We see a lot of different requirements. We see a lot of different things that we get asked to build, and we use lots of different techniques. My blog is at sharepointnutsandbolts.com. You can get me on Twitter and LinkedIn and so on. All right, now, it seems like every ALM talk that you ever go to has to start out with some definition of ALM. I don't know why this is. Is it bad juju if somebody stands up and talks about this without defining it? I don't know. But I think maybe one answer is because application lifecycle management is such a big area and it can mean so many different things that maybe it is good to sort of start out by thinking about the specific areas that we're focusing on. I think that every ALM talk that I've ever gone to probably hasn't answered all my questions. Maybe this one won't do for yours, but it is a big area, and these are the kind of the sub-areas that I want to focus on today. So when I think of ALM, I think about developing in a team and making sure that we've got a smooth process, that everybody can be productive. And I think about planning ahead. So we're not just thinking about what happens in our dev environments, but how are we going to make this release into our client environments? How are we going to update production? And really what we're trying to do is minimize the stress of those upgrades and those deployment days. I often say that that day, if you're sort of taking some kind of release to a client and you're upgrading their production environment, that's a stressful time. There's quite a few things to think about generally in the SharePoint world. And really, with ALM, we're trying to practice the deployment beforehand, practice the upgrade beforehand, so we've got no surprises. Now, some of the techniques that we might use to help us get there are things like continuous integration, so the idea of building the code from what is the latest versions checked in to source control. Maybe taking that further with continuous deployment, so not just building the packages from the checked-in code, but actually doing something with them, deploying them. And we're really trying to get to a point where, we don't have packages being built on dev machines. We don't have the special guy, and he's the only guy that knows the process. We want some kind of build environment that's producing these for us. We get to avoid any kind of human errors this way, and hopefully we get consistent packages that are built the right way. As we mature, maybe we go a little bit further and we start to build in some quality checks to these automated processes. There's a lot of things you can do there, and often that's where the real value lies. But the fundamental thing is to try and get some of these automated processes in place, and from there you can go on and do lots of different things. Now, if you've ever done any work around sort of application lifecycle management and traditional SharePoint development with farm solutions, that was a pretty complex situation. You might remember that you probably needed some on-premises build environment, maybe a TFS server or something else. You start to need a SharePoint environment to deploy to if you're going that far. And you need to create a VM that is somehow representative of your production environment. And you start to need to customize the build process, and that was pretty horrendous because it's all this workflow XAML in TFS 2012. But you'd also have lots of PowerShell. We'd have solution files, WSPs, they would need to be deployed somewhere. Maybe we have to activate some features. All that was typically PowerShell. And if we've got this situation of the TFS build server and a SharePoint VM, you start to need PowerShell remoting between the two environments, and it's really complex. I did a lot of work in this area. I produced some stuff that I published to SharePointCI.codeplex.com, worked with Microsoft on it. But all these moving pieces and all this PowerShell was really complex. And even after I spent so much time on it, my main sort of conclusion was that it was just a whole world of pain. Out of interest, did anybody do any work in that space? Did you set up any automated build processes? All right, that's quite a few. And I'd love to know whether you sort of went as far as deploying them and you kind of went this far, or maybe you were just having the packages built. But I think it was definitely painful if you were taking it to the extreme. Now, I guess what I'm here to tell you is in this new world, if you're able to leverage some of the building blocks that I'm suggesting today, things are much easier for apps compared to SharePoint WSPs and farm solutions. And one of the reasons is that with apps, you're typically talking about just some web stack stuff. Usually it's ASP.NET if we're Microsoft developers. Maybe it's something else. But here, ALM gets so much easier because it's what the rest of the world is doing. And it's kind of a solved problem in many ways. So less worrying about SharePoint specifics and more falling in line with the rest of the world. Now, let's just sort of try and get everybody on the same page and think about what we mean by apps and add-ins and all the different permutations that we can have there. So I think of it as two different flavors and two different sets of permutations, and ultimately these can be mixed and matched. But when we talk to clients, we try and make sure they understand exactly what they're going to have. So for a start, we can think about the new flavor of Office 365 app development. That's an app that gets registered in Azure AD, and it's probably using the new Office 365 APIs around mail, calendar, contacts, files. You've maybe seen some stuff this week around this. The other flavor, of course, is what we knew of in terms of the app model for the last 2 years, and that's really around developing what we'd now call an add-in for SharePoint or an add-in for Office. And that's really using the provider-hosted or SharePoint-hosted models. And things work differently between these different two types of apps. We've got different authentication, probably different APIs that are being used, and so on. But the other side of it is both of those are probably going to be some kind of ASP.NET app. And in all of those cases, we need to put that app somewhere. That's a set of web application files, and we need to deploy them. And maybe we're going to put them on some IIS servers that we have, or maybe we're going to publish them to Azure, and that's where the app will actually run. And that model basically applies whether it's an Office 365 app or a SharePoint add-in. Now, my message here today is, even if you're thinking about your apps running on IIS, maybe because you're trying to have everything within the firewall, this is a purely on-premises deployment, even if you're in that space, if you can use Azure as a building block in your dev phase, you might find this useful because so much of it is a solved problem. So what I'm going to show you is this use of Azure. And historically, I'd be the last guy to say you should have a test environment that is different to production. Usually we would all agree that that just does not make sense. Here, what I'm saying is, maybe Azure in the dev phase makes sense because there's so much, it's giving you so much in terms of ALM and a process, which I'll show you, even if you're on IIS in production. So it's just an idea, it's something to think about, but I think you'll find that there's probably some value in it, so it's worth considering. Now, when you are able to use Azure in your dev phase, you get some of this ALM goodness for a really kind of low cost in many ways. You don't need all that pain of configuring TFS and custom build scripts and SharePoint environments and so on. You don't need that stuff if you're able to use Azure and Visual Studio Online. So if you can engineer it so that your dev phase is able to use these building blocks, so you're able to publish an app for Azure, even if it's just a test instance, and you're able to use Visual Studio Online to store your code, and maybe it's not your primary source code repository even, because you've got to use something else. Well, if you can use that combo, so much of the ALM things are taken care of for you that it's almost worth looking at, even if it's not your default choices. So this is what we're going to look at first. And really where you get to is a point where, without too much effort, without too much configuration, you get this automated process of a dev checking in, the latest version of the code being built, it gets deployed somewhere, and this is all Microsoft stuff that's taking care of this for you. It's all the cloud services of Azure and Visual Studio Online. And then the output is your app getting deployed to an Azure website, and you can test that. Maybe you've got some testers that are constantly looking at it. Maybe it's just you group of devs that are using it as a reference point. And every time somebody makes a code change, we're refreshing this app in Azure. So let's go and take a look at this process. All right, so I'm going to start with a particular app. Now, I could have kind of constructed a small app of my own and made a little simple app. Actually, there's so many good sample apps now coming from Microsoft that it makes sense if you need to do any playing around with something, if you need to investigate something, it kind of makes sense to use one of those. They've got this repository on GitHub under the Office Dev branch, and there's a whole heap of great sample apps that are good for learning code, but if ever you're thinking about your dev processes, it's good to play around with these, because these are ready-made apps. The functionality works. If you find that something is broken in the app, then it's probably something that is wrong with your configuration or some change that you've made. So it's a great starting point. So what I'm doing here is there is an MVC app, which is an Office 365 flavor of app, and I'm bringing it down to my virtual machine that I work in. Now, I can do this by obtaining the zip. I can just download the zip and get the files. It's in GitHub, so I can clone the repository. And what that does is bring all the app files down to my machine, and then I've got a Visual Studio project that I can build. Now, the files are now on my machine, and I've done a right-click and build for the first time. That's succeeded. It's actually restored a load of NuGet packages to my machine. It's taken care of all the dependencies that this app needs. Now, for an Office 365 app, you actually have to do a bit more first-time config as a developer. You have to register this app with your Office 365 environment. Now, Visual Studio has some funky dialogues that are kind of new to this space that help do this for you. Now, you need to specify a few things, like you need to give the app a name that you can recognize. You need to specify all of the things that the app can do in terms of its permissions. So if it's an app that is going to read or send email, you need to specify that. You need to specify the URL. So I've decided ahead of time where this app will run. And I'm choosing to run it in Azure. This is just going to be a test instance of my app. And I'm going to publish my app there. And that's where the ASP.NET files will run from. So I'm making a note of that URL in Azure. Nothing exists there yet. I haven't even created that URL in Azure in any way. But I need to make a note of it in the app config, and I need to check all of the things in permission terms that this app can do. And this is what Office 365 app development looks like. So I know that this sample app does all these things. It's a sample app that exercises all the different bits of the API. So effectively, I need to go and check lots of boxes. The point of doing that, by the way, is that the end user or the tenant admin, when they install this app, they get asked to consent to that list of things that the app can do. And if they don't consent to it, then the app won't install. If you as a developer omit those steps of specifying what the app can do, then those calls in your code will fail. So it's making sure that the user is okay with the things that the app can do on his or her behalf. Now, if I go to Azure Active Directory, and this is the thing that is behind Office 365, so you might know that if you've got 10,000 Office 365 users, they all live in an Azure Active Directory behind your Office 365 tenant. Now, Azure AD contains a few things. It contains users, but it also contains applications. An Office 365 application gets registered here. And really, that's a registration that Visual Studio has just done for me through those dialogues. So that line there wasn't there before, and I haven't configured it manually in the Azure portal. That is another option, but it's Visual Studio that's made that registration for me. Now, a final bit of the setup that I need to do as a developer to try and get this app working somewhere is this particular app needs a GUID from your Office 365 tenancy. It's known as the tenant ID. And all these instructions for these setup steps are basically in the README for the app. And I'm just walking through them, bringing the app down to my machine, doing the configuration, and so on. Now, this particular app needs this GUID in its web.config because there's a bit of the code somewhere in there that pulls it out. As I say, this is all in the README file, and it also tells you how to obtain that GUID. So you see there this entry in the web.config file for enter your tenant ID here. So what I'm going to do is just drop in my GUID for my tenant ID, and then we'll complete the configuration. So where we're up to so far is we've started the kind of one-time config of this app. It doesn't live anywhere. I haven't put it anywhere. I've got all these ASP.NET files on my C drive, but I haven't published them anywhere. So soon we're going to have to think about where this thing is going to go. There's some final bits in this app registration that I need to update. I've picked my Azure URL, which should hopefully still be available. I need to update that in a couple of places in the app config in Azure Active Directory. And from there, I should be kind of ready to go. So we've got the registration for the app. That's all in Azure AD. This is what's needed for an Office 365 app. Now what we need to think about is putting the app somewhere. I could publish from Visual Studio to Azure if I've got that connection in place. But really what we're thinking about is not a one-time publish. We're trying to set up this automated process so that any change to the code results in a refresh to this Azure website and the app running there. So what we're going to do now is set up that automated process. And what we have to do is add our code somewhere that Azure can talk to. So I'm going to add my code to Visual Studio Online. And like I'm saying, if you can't maybe use Visual Studio Online as your primary source code repository, you've got other options. But if you can get this into your dev phase somewhere, you can use this as a building block. Now, I'm going to come back later to these other options about what happens if you really can't check in your code to Visual Studio Online. In this case, I'm able to. We use it as our source code repository, so that's all kind of simple for me. And what I want to do is check in my code to Visual Studio Online, and I want to create a website in Azure. So this is now known as an Azure web app, but this is the space that my app is going to run from. So it needs to be hosted somewhere. I'm not hosting it in IIS, I'm hosting it in Azure, and I've decided my URL that I want. Here, I'm now creating this space in Azure for this app to run from, to be hosted from. And there's this checkbox that says Publish from Source Control. And this is the goodness that Microsoft are providing to you. So I've checked that, I have some other options to configure, like this app actually uses SQL in the background, so I need to do some specification and say, okay, SQL is needed, and I actually already have a SQL database behind Azure, so I need to give it the details. And this is really all about the one-time configuration of hosting this app in Azure. So, Azure is now asking me, where is my source code? And I tell it, it's in Visual Studio Online. And this is the association being made. So it asks for the details of my Visual Online subscription. And now it says, okay, am I okay to go and grab code from there? And both of these things are mine. So the answer is yes, of course. And it wants to know, okay, which area of my Visual Studio Online hierarchy can it get the code from? So I tell it. And now, where I'm getting to is a place where I've got my code checked in Visual Studio Online, I've got my Azure web app over here, and we've got some association between the two. So there's the website, or the web app as it's now known. Nothing lives there yet. The application hasn't been published there. But now that's really what we need to turn our attention to now. So if I go to the deployments area, I'll see that there's no list of deployments that have happened already. It's just telling me that, yes, the association is there, the link between Azure and Visual Studio Online is there, but there isn't a history of deployments yet. Now, there's quite a few things that I can configure on an Azure web app. So I can go and change the framework version. I can go and set some app config settings and web config settings and things like that. And it's really quite a good hosting environment for apps. But as I say, there's nothing there yet. This is just a blank page that you get once you've created a space in Azure, and I haven't published yet. So I could do a one-time publish from Visual Studio, and I could right-click and publish. But now that we've got this association in place, another option is I can start to test this. So if I make a code change now and check in, what should happen is that my files get published to Azure automatically, and this should happen on every check-in. So let's make the first change since putting this stuff down, and I could make a change to some .NET C# code behind the app, maybe something in an MVC controller. I'll just do something simple, like make a change in one of the views, one of the layout files in one of the MVC views, and I'm going to check this code in. And now, if we've done those config steps okay, what we should find is that a build is running, and it's now going to publish my app there for the first time. So you can see the blue icon there that's got a play button. So that's telling me that a build is running. And now we've got this automated build process that Microsoft are mainly taking care of. And with the magic of video, I've kind of fast-forwarded a little bit, and the build has succeeded. So now if I browse to that space in Azure, we have an app. And this is what that sample app looks like. It's the app that Microsoft provides to help you learn some of these APIs. Now, if I sign in, this Office 365 app is going to be able to talk to my Office 365 tenancy. And it's going to be able to use its functionality within the app, and it should be able to read my mail and send mail and read my files in my OneDrive library and so on. So I've just signed in. This app recognizes who I am, but it also has my code change. So we can see that we really have deployed the very, very latest version of the code, and we've deployed to Azure automatically. So from now on, any code change I make to any file, as soon as I check it in, is going to be published automatically to Azure, and that website is constantly refreshed. And that's great for testing. It's great as a reference point for all the developers in the team. Maybe it's what I'm pointing my testers to. Maybe it's what I'm pointing my client to. So we've basically got this process now. And really, it's that idea of as soon as a dev checks in, we have this auto deployment to Azure. Now, if you try and set that up with some on-premises IIS servers and some on-premises build servers, That took 13 minutes, that video. I guarantee you it will take a lot longer than 13 minutes if you're having to do these things yourself. So I guess this is what I'm saying, that if you can find a way of using these building blocks into your dev process, you get so much for free that it starts to make, quite a compelling argument, really. So, to summarize, really what we've done there is we've started some Office 365 development, we've configured a project, it gets registered in Azure AD for an Office 365 app. We added the solution to source control, so Visual Studio Online in this case. We created an Azure web app to actually host the app, and then we selected this crucial Publish from Source Control button. And now we've got this association in place. We now have an automated build process, and we've kind of got it at low cost. 14 minutes of effort, yep, so I need a Visual Studio Online subscription, I need an Azure subscription too, but I'm just using the free mode of Azure here. I don't need high availability and high scale for this test instance of the website. So, I'm using the free version of Azure, and I'm also using the free version of Visual Studio Online that gives me 5 licenses. So, low cost in terms of effort, but low cost in terms of licensing too. Now, a little side note on some of this stuff that we're talking about with Azure. So, you might have seen, if you work with Azure, that we've basically got this situation where there's a new portal coming. It has a lot of the functionality. It's quite a slick user experience. But some of the things that we need to do aren't in there yet. So for some of the stuff that I'm talking about here, we're in this strange world of having to do some things in the old portal and some things in the new portal. And that's just how it is here in spring 2015. So that will change, and Microsoft will put everything into the new portal. But for now, Azure Active Directory, anything that you need to do there, you'll be in the old portal. So if you're starting to see different flavors of Azure in presentations and conferences, and even in this talk, that's the reason. Now, one of the things that is only in the new portal is something called deployment slots, and that's something that we're going to think about now. So if you consider that we've got this awesome build process now, and it didn't take us too much effort to get there, that thing that is in Azure, what is that? Is that just a dev instance of our app? Are we going to call it test? It's probably not production, right? Because we don't want to auto-deploy over production without a whole heap of control and manual testing. So what is that really? Well, it's some kind of dev instance, it's some kind of test instance. So how do we then think about the full end-to-end process? So we've got this auto-refresh of something, but how do we take the changes from there and actually overwrite the production instance? And how do we deal with this? Well, we get to some interesting cases here, especially if we're doing any kind of Office 365 development. So something that I've recommended in the past, and something that my team do, is we create multiple Office 365 tenancies. We create one that we call dev, we create one that we call test, and our client usually creates the one that is production. Now, we have many reasons for doing this, but we like the isolation of everything, whether it's search, taxonomy, user profiles. We want isolation of those top-level things. So I've kind of recommended this approach in the past. However, when you do this, like we do, you start to have some extra considerations around apps, and you get a slight challenge that you need to deal with. So if you're doing any kind of Office 365 app development, so maybe you're using the Office 365 APIs, or it's just an app that is maybe not doing that, but using Azure AD for sign-in and authentication, then you need to worry about this thing. Now, really, what's happening here is that if you have 3 different tenancies, you also have 3 different Azure instances behind those, 3 different Azure Active Directories, but 3 different Azure instances, effectively. And these apps need to be registered in the right Azure AD for the environment. So it needs to be registered in the dev one, it needs to be registered in the test one, and it needs to be registered in the production one. And it needs to be deployed to 3 different places. And that's kind of complicated. It's doable, you could manage that. But it does start to become complicated if you have multiple Office 365 environments. Now, I gave this some thought, and I thought there must be a better way, right? And, here's just a clearer version of this. Basically, the key thing to understand here is that there is an Azure AD behind every Office 365 instance, and you're going to need your app to be deployed and registered in each. Now, I gave some thought to this issue, and we do have some other issues with the kind of multiple environments approach. Because what we often find is that when we have these separate environments, really none of the others are truly production-like for Office 365 app development. And this is one of my kind of little gripes with the whole model that we have at the moment. It works great for Office 365 and works great for running the platform and end users. But in terms of app development, there's some things that probably a little bit suboptimal. So we have these other environments, but they're not like production in every respect. They probably don't have single sign-on with the organization's Active Directory. They don't have that domain integration. So the accounts in these environments are typically on Microsoft.com accounts. It might be chris.fu on Microsoft.com. And it's not really the same identity as an account in the on-premises Active Directory. We don't have that integration. And this is where kind of the dev and platform and infrastructure worlds meet. That's usually a concern of the platform and infrastructure guy, and he's maybe implementing Azure AD Sync, which is going to sync users from Active Directory up to the cloud. But you usually don't have that for anywhere other than production. And we don't have other things. Maybe we don't have the same license type because we're trying to save cash. We don't want a whole load of E3 licenses to match production because that can be expensive for dev and test environments. We actually just use SharePoint P2 for our dev environments, and we don't tend to need Exchange and Link for development. Maybe you haven't got Yammer Enterprise, and you're doing some kind of app that maybe talks to Yammer, or we use it a lot for page commenting and things like that. And maybe you don't have those things. You won't have a full directory of 15,000 users, or 50,000 users, or however many your organization has. So there are some trade-offs with this approach, and it gets in the way for app development. So I started thinking about this, and a potential answer here is something called Azure deployment slots. Now, with Azure deployment slots, this is really allowing you to have segregation just purely on the Azure side. And really what I'm starting to sort of think about is how these work and how we can use them in app development. Now, what happens is you basically, on the Azure side, you define additional instances of your web app. And every time you do this, it basically, you assign it a name. You could call it test, you could call it staging, or UAT, or whatever. And it's going to give you another flavor of this website. Now, if you do this, you basically have an option of having the isolation only on the Azure site, and you're ultimately just using your production Office 365 environment for testing. Now, straight away, that sounds really crazy. It sounds really weird in some ways, but there's some things you can do that make this a really good model. And you get the benefits, of course, of having your true single sign-on. You can sign on from SharePoint to the app and get true pass-through like it would be in production. You've got a full directory of users, you've got Yammer, you've got everything because you're in that production environment. But that's production SharePoint. Over in the Azure, you have different branches for dev, test, and production. And that's what the deployment slots is giving you. So when you do this, you'll give a slot a name. You may be calling it dev or test. It's going to append something to the URL with that name. So it'll be -dev, -test. And everything gets its own URL in Azure, but it also gets its own settings and an SCM site, if you're familiar with Azure web apps and how they work. And basically, you get a different slot for your web application for each one that you create. Now, when you have more than one of these things, you can swap them. And this is how you'd push an update to production. So you've segregated your app on the Azure side, and you can now swap test and production. It's kind of interesting because this is a swap. It's not a copy. I'm not updating production by copying what's in test and deploying over that. I'm doing a genuine swap. And that needs some thought because that's a bit unusual for a production deployment process. You can do it in two ways. There's a button in the Azure portal. There's also a PowerShell commandlet. but basically this is a way of making changes live, if you like. So some of that might sound a bit confusing. Let's go and look at this in reality, and let's see if we can make it make a little bit more sense. All right, so what we're going to do here is we are going to take what we did in Demo 1, and we have a website, a web app in Azure. I'm in the new portal now because, as I mentioned, deployment slots only can be managed in the new portal, so that's why the Azure side looks a little bit different. And if I go into this web application, what I can do is go and see its settings, and I can go and change some properties and so on. And I've got this area called deployment slots. So if I drill into here, this is where I'd go to create a new deployment slot. So I'll select Add Slot, and we'll give this thing a name. Now, we'll call it Staging. And I've got this option in this next drop-down to clone configuration. I can basically take all the configuration from my previous instance, and I can copy it. I'm not going to do that in this case. But now I have my slot created, and we called it Staging. Now, when I drill into here, what I find is that each slot has quite a few things that I can do. Firstly, if we go and take a look at what's at that slot, nothing. There is nothing there yet. Right? It's empty. And you might have noticed that it had a different URL. It had -staging in there. So I could publish my app to this slot. And I could do it in Visual Studio. I could do a right-click and publish. And I could give it the details of where to publish to. But how about this? How about we change that automated build process from step 1, and we repoint it? So we're now going to be deploying every checked-in code to the staging instance of this website. So that first one that we configured, maybe we'll think of that as production. But this new thing here, we're going to think of it as staging. We're going to edit our build process to now deploy all the changes on every check-in to staging. Now, in the build process, I can go and edit some settings. And this is all configured for me. You didn't see me configure this. This is what Microsoft did in Visual Studio Online. And if I want to repoint something to go to a certain slot, I just add the slot's name in brackets in this Azure Deployment Environment property. What I can do now is I could make a code change, and it should deploy my app to the staging slot. Instead of making a code change, I'm just going to right-click and do New Build. And hopefully this should start deploying my latest version of my app files and deploy it to the staging slot now. And it says that the build succeeded. It said it deployed it to the staging URL. So now if I browse there, hey presto, my app is there. And it's got my update and so on. So that's great. So we've got the app there. But this is Office 365 app development. And let's start to think about the end-to-end thing that we're trying to achieve here. So this is where Office 365 apps get access from an end user. And I really want to get to a point where, I'm thinking about the full end-to-end thing. I'm not just thinking about my app in isolation. I'm thinking about how it integrates with Office 365, how users pass through from Office 365 to my app, and so on. Now, there's some interesting things about this. These apps get registered in Azure AD, if you remember. And what we have to do is we need a separate registration of this app to make everything line up and to get full single sign-on between Office 365 and the app. Now, previously, we used Visual Studio's dialogues to create one of these registrations. What I'm doing here is adding a second registration that is going to point to the staging instance of the app. And when we do this, it's going to be made available to some users that I can select, and they'll get it in their Office 365 app launcher. Now, the way Office 365 apps work is that apps get assigned to users. And in this case, the user that is me, so that's cob@chrisobrien.com, he has this staging instance of the app defined. Now, what should happen here is that that app is becoming visible in his app launcher. Now, it would be a bit confusing if I've got two very similar apps right next to each other. So for this test instance, I'm giving it a different logo so that I can identify it in the app launcher. That's a logo that I put all my my hardcore UX skills in Photoshop. That's really my specialist area, as you can see. So I'm giving it a second logo so that I can differentiate it, I can pick it out from the list and so on. Now this app registration, it needs to point to the staging URL. It also needs all those permission requests, you know, that the app can do. So remember this sample app, it can send email, it can add contacts, it can add calendar items. So I need to go and configure those. And when you're doing one of these app registrations manually, this is done in the Azure App Portal, and this is where the checkboxes are. So it's just that we use Visual Studio when we did it the initial time. So I'm going through my app's config. I'm telling it all the things that my app can do, and I'm saving this app registration. Where we're trying to get to here is this end-to-end situation of we've got the staging instance of our app, and the app has been published there, so it now exists in staging and production. But we're trying to get to this end-to-end thing of it being integrated with Office 365. And what I'm saying is we're going to just use the Office 365 production tenant now, where we've got all of the data and so on. So there's the staging instance of my app. It's appeared next to my other apps in the My Apps page. And I can click through. So I've got single sign-on. I can basically pass through and get to the app. Now, I actually didn't single sign-on. And if I sign in, oh, we've got a problem. Things aren't working as we hoped. And this is just another little detail. So the error that we see is that, hey, the address that we redirected to, which is the staging one, we didn't expect that. And this is just another detail that you have to take care of if you're doing this deployment slots approach. So we did all the config for the staging slot, but the way these Office 365 apps work, they basically have some details in them, like a client ID and password that is used for security and authentication. Now the problem is, that stuff is coming from the web config file. And we've got two different app registrations. We've got the staging one and the production one, but we've only got one web config file. So it's going to be wrong in one place. We've got the right GUID, the right client ID for production, and that's why production works and you can sign in there. But it's wrong for staging. We need a different GUID there. But how do we manage this when we've only got one web config file? You know, that's a challenge. Now, those are the settings that are in the web config file. As I say, they're going to be right for one environment, but wrong in the other. Now, fortunately, Azure gives us a nifty thing that we can do here. We can override web config settings for a certain slot. So we can take advantage of this, and what we need to do is, for our staging slot, we're going to have the client ID that is correct. We're going to override what's in web config. And that's how we can get around this problem of only having one web config file, but we've got these two different instances of the app that need these different identifiers. So I'm obtaining the client ID for the staging instance. I can get this from the Azure portal. It's the ID that is needed for the authentication to work. And there's two elements. There's a client ID and password. And what I'm doing is I'm going to make a note of those in Notepad. And this is how I obtain the password. I get a key from the Azure portal. I make a note of that somewhere. And those two things are going to allow my app to authenticate and sign into Office 365. So, like I say, we can't put them in the web config, because then we'd have staging working, but production broken. So we're going to use this idea of the deployment slots. And it's here that we can do the override of a setting that is in web config. So I'm going to paste in the right value, and we got this checkbox here which says slot setting, and that's the thing that makes it slot specific. So we're saying that only the staging slot should override the web config values. Now the scope of this nifty trick is really around app settings in the web config file. It can also be used for connection strings, but those are the two main things. You can't override massive sections of the file or anything like that. So, I'm telling Azure of these correct values for the staging instance, and I'm saying that they are slot-specific settings. If I save this configuration now in Azure, okay, we just got a success message now. And now if I do a refresh, what we should be able to do is find that the staging instance of the app is now fully working. I can click sign in, and this should now work because it's got the correct authentication identifiers. So it signed me in. It actually used my existing token, so it now recognizes me. And if I start to use the app's functionality, if I click on sort of the files area, for example, everything should work. It's now talking to my real Office 365 tenancy, and the app functionality works. So, you know, a little detail that you have to take care of if you're going with this approach, but, you know, that's the information you need. Now, as you'd expect, we've now got our automated build process, which is now talking to the staging slot. And we've done all the configuration so that the staging slot properly works and an app there can sign in and work okay. Now let's make a code change, and now let's think about this process. So now that we've got staging and production instances of the app, what is our go live process? So I've made a code change and I've checked in. Because of that update to the build, that should now be overwriting the staging instance of our app. All right? So let's go and take a look at that. I made a change to the big title at the top. Right? It now says COB ALM project. That's my simple change that I'm using to illustrate things. And that has been successfully deployed to staging now. All right? So now, what is the process for pushing this change live? You know, let's say we've tested that, we're happy with it. You know, what do we need to do to make this live? Well, this is where this swap idea of deployment slots comes in. Now, like I say, we can do this in PowerShell, or we can do it in the Azure portal. I'm doing it in the Azure portal, and I'm navigating to the web app, and I'm going to go into its settings. And when this comes up, we'll see all the details of my app and its different slots and so on. And here's our swap button. So if I click swap, Azure now gives me some options. So it's asking which slots to swap. If I had a whole range of them, if I had 5 of them defined, it would ask me which ones I want to swap with which. And it's also giving me a warning. It's saying, hey, you've got some differences here. And if I preview the changes for these differences, it's trying to warn me about some things that might not be right. And it's things like, hey, you've got some slot-specific config here. Do you know about that? Is that intentional? And yeah, it is intentional for me. That's the thing that's making my staging instance work properly. So I'm okay with all those things, but if you had anything that isn't right, then that's a good warning for you before you make a swap. And it says that I've now successfully swapped these slots. So let's go and take a look at the results. Now, as I say, this isn't a copy, this is a swap. And this is really about Azure. What it's doing, in fact, is changing DNS pointers. And that's the thing that makes it a swap. So, you know, something to consider here. And if I then basically go to production, which doesn't have -staging in the URL, it's got my change. So I've pushed this update live. And that's now my go live process when I'm using this model. Back on staging, it's got the old version. It doesn't have COB ALM, it has Office 365 Starter Project. And that's what I mean about it being a swap. Now, this is a good thing, because what this gives you, that SharePoint was really not very great for, is a rollback mechanism. If I've got a problem with that update and I deployed it to production and I found, oh hey, we've got a problem in production and now I need to roll back, I could just hit the swap button again, or I can execute the PowerShell commandlet and swap back. And that's really good. You know, a key part of ALM is understanding your rollback strategy, and Azure slots really give you that quite well. But you do have to think about, okay, so that's my update in production. but you do have to think about how to handle that. So what we've done is we've basically created an additional deployment slot. We had to deal with this separate registration of the app in Azure Active Directory. That's the URL there if ever you need to reference the instructions for that. And we've done some slot-specific config so that the authentication works and our app is happy. And then we've deployed the app to the slot. Now, of course, what you need to think about is, all right, what if I don't need to roll back? What if I'm happy now, but now whatever is in the staging slot is kind of old and out of date? So what is the process for pushing the updates to that slot also? Well, this is kind of a very long and wordy description of that, but it's basically the logical steps that you'd expect. What we've now got to do is publish the latest version of the code overwriting the staging slot. And our mechanism to do that is basically just to do a manual publish from Visual Studio. But it's a bit like that thing that you would expect. That's the description. It's a bit like you've got to take the fox over the river first and then bring back the chicken and then bring back the chicken feed and take the fox. And it's basically that kind of dance that you would expect. But that's the logical description of it, and I think it makes sense when you read it. Now, some other things to throw in here that you can do with slots that I find really interesting is basically you can use them in different ways as well as just sort of dev and test. So what you can do is actually use a traffic routing feature of Azure to send some of your traffic in production to the staging version of your website. Now, what this would enable you to do is kind of do some A/B testing, or perhaps do some, you've deployed some new functionality, you're not sure how it's going to work out. You really want 5 or 10% of the users to try this. You're trying to do some soft launch of something. Maybe you've got some logging in the code or some diagnostics, and you can basically send a certain proportion of your traffic basically to a different slot. So these slots are pretty cool, and Azure is giving us some really good building blocks that are going to help us as we go through the process of developing our apps. All right, so we've talked quite a lot about Office 365 app development, and I'm kind of conscious that not many people put their hand up and said, yeah, we're doing this, and this is the flavor of app development that we're doing. And for my team, we're still going to do a lot of SharePoint add-in development. Usually it's provider-hosted apps for us. We do some SharePoint-hosted too, but I guess we find that for the most part, they're provider-hosted. And obviously in the provider-hosted model, you end up still with some kind of ASP.NET website. Now, I've showed you a load of things specific to Office 365 app development, but what is different if we're just in this model and we're developing SharePoint add-ins? Well, the good news is not a lot. So we actually have some great support here specifically for developing SharePoint add-ins. And what we get to is if this is an add-in that perhaps can be deployed to a site that is routable, it has a URL. It could be on-premises SharePoint, or it could be Office 365. We have some specific settings in the build that Microsoft give us that enable the app package, because that's what you have, remember. With a provider-hosted app, you have the app files, maybe it's ASP.NET, and then you have the .app file that traditionally goes into an app catalog, or you hand it off to the store. Well, we've got some specific things for this flavor of app development. Remember that if you are developing these kind of apps, you've got some other things to take care of, like using app-reg-new to register the app. And if you've done this kind of app development, that will mean something to you. But what you get to do is edit a different setting in the build, and this really takes care of deploying the app package to a SharePoint environment. So once you've done this, the build will run. It will deploy the ASP.NET files to the website that you specify. Maybe it's in Azure. But it will also deploy the app package to your SharePoint environment. If you are doing Office 365, then you can provide a URL in the cloud, so some site collection in some dev tenant or something like that, and it will push up your app package there too, and it will install the app, and the only thing that needs to be done is the app needs to be trusted. And the build even gives you a URL to click to do that. So again, let's just take a quick look at this. This is a short demo in comparison to the other ones. This is just around 3 minutes. But let's go and think about this process for continuous deployment for SharePoint app development. All right, so I mentioned that there were a couple of settings that were different in the build. And we see this one, which is basically the SharePoint deployment environment. And we've also got this other one, which is path to deployment settings. Now, this points to a published profile for an Azure website. And you have to do some fritzing with this file, because there's some things that you need to change, like the URLs need to be on HTTPS, and there's another element that you can change. Now, the details for that fritzing I'm not showing in this demo, but I have a URL on the next slide that points you to the detail there. So, you have to point to a specific published profile. You have to have downloaded that from the Azure website. But if you want to auto-deploy your app package, which you do if it's a SharePoint provider-hosted app, then what you can do is provide a URL of a SharePoint site collection, and it should be based on the developer site template. And then if you provide that, the build process can take care of this as well. So Microsoft have really thought of quite a lot of flavors of app development here. They've thought about all the things that you might need to do for Office 365 app development, but they've also thought about SharePoint add-ins and provider-hosted apps and so on. So I've specified the SharePoint deployment site, and this is where my app is going to be auto-installed to, because SharePoint apps need to be installed to a site. And now if I run this build, we should find that both of these things happen. So my app files would be deployed to an Azure website, and my app package would be installed to a SharePoint site. Right, so the build is queued, and with the magic of fast forward and video editing, it should complete any second now. All right, so build succeeded. Let's go and look at the details. And I mentioned that in this build report, Microsoft put a URL, which is the trust URL. Now, somebody needs to click this for everything to work out okay, because a SharePoint app needs to be trusted. Now, they're basically putting this in your build report as a convenience. So the first thing you need to do is kind of hit that link, and you'll see the trust dialog. You'll see the trust option where you have to consent to all the things that the app can do. And now the app is installed, and the trust should all work out, and the app should be able to do the things that it can do. Now, you could click that manually every time. So if you've got a nightly build process, you could click that every morning. You could probably do something else, like hit it automatically with a web test or something like that. You could hit it with PowerShell if you need to, make a web request to it. So long as something is hitting that URL, then you've got the trust happening, and then everything's going to work out. But just to show you, this is another provider-hosted app. I've stepped out of SharePoint. I navigated from the site contents page of my app, and I was over into my provider-hosted app, and everything worked out okay. So those are the differences, basically, for provider-hosted apps. All right, so just a summary there. Basically, much of it is very much the same. We need an Azure web app, an Azure site to host the app. We need that link to source control. We've got some specific things to do for SharePoint add-ins. So we need to register the app with AppRegNew. We need to do this fritzing with the published profile in Azure. And that's the URL, by the way, that has the detailed steps for that. That's the post from Kirk Evans that you might have come across. And what you can do is specify a SharePoint site to deploy the app package to, and it's going to take care of all the details. It's going to take care of deploying the app package and deploying the app files itself. All right, so I said I'd come back at the end to this idea of, okay, what happens if you can't really use these building blocks? What happens if you can't use Azure or you can't use Visual Studio Online for your code? Well, there's some good news here that might help you out if you're in this position. So in actual fact, your code doesn't really need to be stored in the Visual Studio Online repository. You've got some options here. So Visual Studio Online is able to integrate with other repositories for source code. You could use a Git repository on some server, but maybe you're not down with Git. Maybe you're not that cool and hipster yet. Maybe you're using something else. Well, one of the other options is Dropbox. Now, that's kind of interesting because you could crank together some solution with Dropbox and whatever is your real source control system where your files are being hosted in Dropbox, but really you're using Subversion or, I won't say Visual Source Safe because I refuse to believe that any of you people would be doing that. But, you know, maybe you're on CVS or Subversion or some other source control system, and maybe you're just using Dropbox in some kind of hand-cranked way to be able to get your files to be integrated with Visual Studio Online. You know, so there's possibilities here, even if your boss or your client is saying, yeah, we're not using Visual Studio Online for our source code. No way. You've still got possibilities with these different branches that you can take, and you'll still get the integration that you need. Now, what if you're not able to use Visual Studio Online and its build infrastructure? What if there's something specific that you need? Well, you can use a lot of this with an on-premises TFS build server. So you could actually integrate one of those things and bring your own TFS build servers, and basically you could still get a lot of this goodness. Now, you do have a lot more work to do here. The scripts that are running the build, they are now with you, and you're not using Microsoft stuff. So if you need to do this, actually Microsoft are providing scripts that are very similar to those running in Visual Studio Online, and you can use them with an on-premises build server. So they publish them at Codeplex. It's kind of a sister project to my original Codeplex project, but that gives you the XAML build workflow and some PowerShell to do all this process of deploying apps and deploying the app package and so on. So you might have reasons for doing that and so on. So we focused quite a lot on this automated build process and different flavors of how to implement this. We've talked about how to do it for Office 365 apps, and we've talked about how to do it for provider-hosted SharePoint add-ins. But I guess the real value comes when you've got that in place and you start to add some extra things to your build. So maybe you want to do some automatic testing now. You've got this Azure website that's being constantly refreshed, and maybe now what you need to do is add some web tests to that. And we've done this. We've used coded UI tests in the past. That works well. There's a couple of challenges, but the coded UI test infrastructure is better now than ever before. That's a good example of something that does need an on-premises build controller. So if you do want to do those testing, then you are going to need to do that extra work. Unit tests are a bit simpler, because that's just executing code against code. You don't need any on-premises kit for that. But that's a good way to start raising the quality of your application now you've got this build process in place. The other one is SPCAF. So SPCAF is a tool that you may or may not be aware of, but it's a great tool for checking SharePoint code and checking SharePoint artifacts like XML and feature XML. There's a whole bunch of stuff in there for provider-hosted SharePoint add-ins. So it can do a whole series of checks that are quite easy to build in. And you don't need an on-premises build controller for that. You do need to edit some of the build definition because you need to call into its hooks. But actually, that's reasonably easy to achieve. And once you've sort of done the build process and got that in place, that is what we've focused on today, there's not too many extra steps to deploy SPCAF to actually do more checking of this code. There's a free version, there's a pay-for version, but overall it's a good product, and they're building more and more checks in there. I really like it because it saves us from having to think about development standards for apps and think about rules. You can dial down the rules and so on, so it's a good tool. All right, so this is mainly some reference information now, some things to come back to later. There's all sorts of small pitfalls on the way that you might lose an hour here, an hour there as you're going through this setup stuff for the first time. So I'm putting this in some of the deck so that you can refer back to these issues if you hit them. But otherwise, I'll point you to some other guys that have published some great information on ALM and build processes and raising code quality. Kirk Evans from Microsoft especially, he's done a lot. And I've sort of spoken to him quite a lot on the work that he's done. Go and check out his posts. Matthias Einig, he's basically the creator of SPCAF. And he's got some good posts because this is his territory too. And same for Jeremy Thake, who you might know from Office 365 and SharePoint Dev in general. All right, so I guess my main message is, maybe you've not done too much with automated builds before. Maybe it's always been something that's a little bit far away, a bridge too far. But, if you can use these building blocks, now is probably the time when it's easier than it ever has been. So I'd really encourage you to go away and give this some thought. Could you build these processes in quite easily? Is it worth giving this as a task to somebody in your team to go and try and implement? And really, where we're at is that because we're in the apps world, things are so much easier than previously with SharePoint farm solutions and features. And we don't have some of that complexity about feature activations and deploying content types and so on. All this stuff is a lot simpler when we're just in ASP.NET and in apps. And we've got great building blocks. Visual Studio Online for the build mechanism. Microsoft take care of so much of that for us. And also Azure for the hosting and having somewhere that is easily auto-refreshed with the latest code changes. All right, so I hope that's of some use. I hope it's given you some ideas. I'm happy to take any questions now, but enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.